Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Telling the Story, Better Accessibility Statements with ASPIRE. My name is Richard Orme, I'm from the DAISY Consortium, and I'm your host today. Let's get this webinar started. I'm delighted to hand over to our panelists who will introduce themselves and tell us how to aspire to better accessibility statements.
Hello all, this is Hugh Alexander. Welcome. Thanks very much, Richard, for your introduction there. I'm joined here today by Alistair McNaught. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be talking today about ASPIRE and helping you to create better accessibility statements so that you can tell your story about your content and your platform and the inclusive publishing work that you're doing within your companies. We've got an overview here of the items that we're going to be touching on through the hour, or just under. Accessibility statements and the law, which is Alistair's going to walk us through, especially in relation to the changes in UK and EU law in recent times. I'm going to be talking to you about the evolution of ASPIRE from the original project through to the service that it now is. And then we'll talk through the process for ASPIREreview, and then we'll look at what makes a good statement, or a gold statement as we call it, in terms of what are the brilliant statements out there in the publishing industry at the moment and what can you learn from them. And finally we'll wrap up with the benefits of writing accessibility statements and why companies should provide them as standard, whether because of the legal requirements or just because it's great practice to do so, and it really does tell your story. So I will hand over to Alistair, who will now talk us through accessibility statements and the law.
Thank you very much. So on the next slide, in the UK context in particular, but this is equally true in the US, legal legislation has been really important at driving accessibility. In the UK context, and indeed the European context, critical to this is that the public sector websites and mobile applications regulations specify for the first time that a failure to meet the accessibility requirement is deemed to be a failure to make a reasonable adjustment. That clarity has never been so well framed before. Secondly, there's a requirement to make accessibility statements for all your digital estate. Let's have a look at what that means. We've grayed out the areas that have gone past already. So the bits that are coming up, 23rd of September 2020, all websites, intranets and digital estate should meet accessibility requirements. It should also have an accessibility statement explaining the extent to which it has succeeded, and also explaining what it fails in and what the alternatives are that a disabled user could use. And by the 22nd of June, that will apply to mobile apps as well. This is important because ebooks count as a website or a part of your digital estate. So let's have a look at the implication of that for libraries. The library obligations are very clear, and we've spoken specifically to government digital services in the UK, and they state that if you pay for or subscribe to digital content, you are funding it, and therefore you are responsible for that content meeting accessibility standards, as well as being responsible for providing an accessibility statement. So for your ebook platforms, your journal platforms, and so on, it's ultimately the customer that bears the legal responsibility. That actually creates some dilemmas. The librarian's dilemma is to be or not to be. Are they going to simply accept poor quality accessibility information from their suppliers and therefore be an unpaid researcher of platform and product accessibility? Are they going to be the author of other people's accessibility statements for products they're already paying for? Are they going to be an unpaid administrative assistant that has to go back and regularly check to make sure their accessibility statement that they wrote on somebody else's product is still up to date? Or are they not going to be any of those things but be a discerning consumer and say, no accessibility statement or a poor accessibility statement, forget it, I'll go for a rival product? So next slide shows how a good accessibility statement actually interleaves with the fundamental requirements of the UK law, and the UK law is based on an EU-wide directive. So get it right for the UK, you get it right for most of Europe. So in the UK law, Section 8 gives us 4 parts that defines what the minimum accessibility statement should look like. It should include an explanation of those parts of the content that are not accessible and the reasons why. Now, a good accessibility statement with a good score on Aspire would do that, because that was exactly what Aspire was built around. It should also, where appropriate, have a description of any accessible alternatives. So how you might tweak a different version, how you might click a hidden button, how you might download an EPUB instead of a PDF, and why that might benefit you. If all of that is in a good Aspire accessibility statement with a good score, then you are covering 2 of the 4 fundamental parts of the accessibility requirement. You are also, you get the bonus in that something that has scored well on Aspire also tells you not just what doesn't work, but very positively and productively what does work that students can benefit from. So if we look at the next slide, I said there was 4 minimal requirements. Now we've identified that a high scoring Aspire accessibility statement will cover 2 of those. There are a couple of things that it can't cover, and nor should it. So on this slide, for example, you can see that the other elements that a good accessibility statement from a university or college point of view has to cover are the contact form. Who do you contact if you've got a problem? Where's the link to the enforcement procedure? Okay, well, you are probably, as a student user, if you're having a problem, you're not going to directly get in contact with your supplier. You're going to contact somebody internally. Now, your learning platform will have an accessibility statement which already says who you contact internally. Your website will have an accessibility statement that will talk about who are the appropriate people to contact if you have accessibility issues. So that's an internal bit of information that already exists. It probably exists in a boilerplate format that you can just slot straight in, not even slot it in, just have a link to it. Then the other part, the other tick on this slide, is the internal enforcement procedure. So again, for any of your internal accessibility statements in a university or college, you'll already have that information. It'll say, you know, this is the enforcement procedure. It's a legal requirement to put that information in, but it's boilerplate. If there are any exemptions or disproportionate burdens that may or may not come into this bit, that's what it means by section C2. But generally speaking, that won't be actually within your purview, because you are not going to be in a position where you change the workflows and so on of your supplier. So that bit you would probably ignore. So the next slide shows you how this daunting prospect of creating an accessibility statement for each of your maybe 50, 60 platforms that you subscribe to actually becomes very straightforward, because it becomes essentially 3 sentences. Find out about the accessibility benefits and barriers. That links to the supplier page on the Aspire website, and if they've got a good score, you can virtually guarantee that they will cover that bit. How to contact us about accessibility difficulties, that's an internal thing, that's fine. You sort that because you've got your boilerplate text. If you need to complain, escalate a complaint, again, that's internal. So you've done it. And if we look at the next slide, the key elements of Aspire, I'm going to give over to Hugh.
Excellent, thanks, Alistair. So if I give you a kind of brief background and run through of how Aspire developed and the evolution of the Aspire project from a project and now to a service. Essentially, as Alistair was walking you through, the legislation for the UK and the EU came in 2000, end of 2018, in September 2018. And so we set up Aspire as a project in the summer of 2018, essentially as a health check of the industry as it stood at that point, and the standard of accessibility statements and the availability of accessibility statements at that time. Excuse me. It was a crowdsourced project, and had a remarkable range of stakeholders across the industry, from librarians and disability officers to publishers to ebook vendors, all across, just putting their input into what was actually critical to them from an accessibility standpoint. We ended up with the actual scoring being done by librarians and disability officers across the UK from 49 different institutions. So it was a real kind of group effort and a voluntary effort as well. People really wanted to see the benefits from all sides, from the publisher side, from the ebook vendor side, and from the librarian and user side. So it was an incredible effort initially to get the Aspire project on off the ground, really. So the process involved 243 audits conducted on 54 different ebook platforms, which is an average of 4.5 audits per platform, and 342 audits conducted on 87 different publishers, and they're publishers from around the world. But it was for publishers and ebook vendors basically that were selling into the UK at that time. So we were testing publishers in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, Canada and America. So it's a huge range and a very good turnout of audits and a number of audits per publisher. So what does Aspire actually measure? We've broken it down to try and simplify accessibility statements as much as possible. As Alistair was mentioning there's only a few certain elements that you really need to concentrate on with your statement. And Aspire tests across a range of criteria, but broadly they're related to communication, content, information, and interaction. So for instance, do you provide contact details for your users to get in touch with you? What types of formats do you provide? Do you provide your content through institutional organisations like the RNIB Bookshare in the UK, or Access Text or Bookshare in the US? What is your approach to DRM settings? Do you provide information about image descriptions? It's basically providing information which you think will be relevant and useful to users, and providing details for them that is actionable. The key findings for us for the initial Aspire project were that there were a number of untold stories, really. If I show you the average scores across publishers and platforms, you'll see that the publisher average was 13% and the platform average was only slightly higher at 22%, which overall isn't that fantastic, really. The story here, though, is the missing information. This is what we really got, the kind of data we got back from those initial tests, was the fact that 87% missing score for publishers and 78% for platforms. This really kind of relates to the fact that the publishers and ebook platforms aren't telling their story. They're not engaging with their audience. Aspire is a fair reflection of the information that's available, but we do think that it is not a reflection of the work being done. Publishers and ebook platforms are investing heavily in terms of money, resources, time, to make accessibility a focus on their content and platforms. The problem is they're not telling that story. They're not providing the information to users. And when we did the project initially in 2018, that was really the key finding. And we've seen that improve in time, but it really is a case of getting out there and telling that story of what you've been doing. And it's remarkable how few publishers and how few ebook vendors were actually doing that at that time. So for next steps, I'll hand back to Alistair and he can walk us through.
Okay, walk us through indeed with the footprints. So if we move to the next slide, the success of the ASPIRE project was that it sat in this unique position between universities, because some of the key stakeholders were library and disability support teams, but it also had buy-in from platform providers, and it also had buy-in from publishers. And the three of them were related because very often the end user experience of a student wasn't necessarily the fault of the platform. It might have been that the publisher's content was inaccessible, or in another case, it was the other way around. The publisher had fantastic content, but by the time it had gone through somebody else's third-party platform, lots of the accessibility was stripped out. So ASPIRE endeavored to sit between these three and actually create a language through which they could talk to one another. So the problem we had, though, was that doing that work, 500 odd audits on platforms and similar numbers on publishers, etc., that was a lot of hard work by volunteers. It was not sustainable. So the overall requirement was, how can we make this last? We've got something that is now recognizable, and the actual scoring was put together by librarians and disability support people alongside publishers and vendors, telling us what was and what was not realistic to put in and to include in terms of what they could actually give you information about. So it was recognizable, but it was not scalable and it was not sustainable. So we needed to move it away from crowdsourced voluntary effort to something that was much more long-term, where people could know exactly that if they were being audited, they were being audited by people that knew exactly what they were doing, not necessarily by a group of anonymous people who may or may not have had the time to do it properly. So the next slide shows, well, basically where it moved to. Hugh Alexander at Textbox Digital offered to host it long term. We recognized that that would involve moving from this totally volunteer crowdsourced model to a commercial model. We talked with the steering group. They felt that it was worth it because it would then give them the sense that they had something that they could begin to trust long term, to give them objective information, not on the quality of the accessibility of the supplier, but on the quality of information and transparency of that accessibility. So we don't go around testing the supplier's accessibility. We test the information, the quality of the information on their accessibility statement, because if you've got good quality information, people can find out whether it will work for their students or not. And I have supported Hugh in that process. So if we look over what do we aim to make ASPIRE, and the next slide shows that as a service there are three key things that we're looking for. We want it to be formative, we want it to be helpful. So it's not just a question of, hey, you didn't do very well on this, here's a bad mark. We talk beforehand, we show the scoring criteria beforehand, we talk people through the process. What we're trying to achieve is something that is a transparent process that's trusted by the people taking part in it and the people using the end content. And it needs to be cost effective, because there are 3,000 or so publishers and imprints that feed into the academic market. So we need something that can have that long tail of small publishers be able to say, yes, we could do this, we could get help making a statement, and we could get a score that is a verified score, that we've been clear on all the key things that librarians and disability support people need. So the next slide shows us the overview of what it involves. So it's basically a 5-day turnaround. So if a publisher wants to commission us to do some work to score their accessibility statements, as soon as we get the go ahead, it's a 5-day turnaround. It's a detailed review looking at all those areas that Hugh had up on the screen earlier, and then it results in an ASPIRE score and also a verified badge. So if you're gold or silver or bronze, you get the badge that you can then pop on your website if you wish to. It puts you on the Aspire list of publishers, so you can see where your ranking is in relation to your rivals, and indeed so can a librarian, a library service thinking of procurement, can then have a look at where you are on that list. And then the final thing it gives you is recommendations as to how to improve, because you just don't want to be told what you've done well and what you haven't done well. We give I mean, in some cases, Hugh and I have written suggested recommendations that have been longer than the accessibility statement that we received. And so it's a very detailed effort to work with you in getting you as transparent and as communicative and as helpful to your customers as you can be. So on the next slide, we've got the just the key bits that matter to publishers, but this might matter to librarians too, because we are not asking publishers for gigantic amounts of money for gigantic amounts of time. We're asking for something short, sharp, and the cost is £200 for the publisher. That, as Hugh has famously said, is probably as much as the some organisations would spend on a lunch with the directors for a day. So these are modest sums, and a retest within 12 months, if you take away all the suggestions for improvement, make the improvements, and then within 12 months get a retest, that's half price. So the next slide just shows you what the Aspire list, if you haven't seen Aspire before, on the Aspire website, there's a list for platforms, a list for publishers, and you can simply see where people are in their ranking, and you can click. If I clicked on Cambridge Core or EBSCO there, I would go straight to their specific Aspire page with the breakdown of their score, what they got for each element. You as a librarian can look at that and think, okay, well, I need to know about text-to-speech. Look at that. Have they got good information on text-to-speech? Yes. Great. Then you know that you've got a product where either they've told you about their text-to-speech, or maybe they've told you that text-to-speech doesn't work. But again, you have the knowledge, the information. You can think about how you would advise students using that particular supplier. So that's the list and the platform. So the stories is a really important one, we feel, for the sector, because it's good for advertising, it's good for marketing, but more importantly, it's good, we think, for each of the suppliers to be able to say, this is our story, this is what we did, this is what we found out. And some of the stories have been incredibly interesting. So one of the stories, for example, talks about, we had all this information already, but it was in disparate places. We hadn't realized how many disparate places we had partial nuggets of information. So those sorts of stories are very helpful for other suppliers to also look at and say, you know what, I think that might be true of us as well. So the stories are really important, and some of the libraries have talked about the stories as well, stories from the data that we've given, stories about how they use the Aspire information. So the impact of Aspire. Now, before we did the this kind of sustainable version of Aspire, when we did the first iteration of Aspire, the crowdsourced one, our scores were all in that lower bracket, apart from one or two creeping up into the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s. What we have now, that we're getting, you know, big organizations come take the information they got from that initial Aspire review, come and ask us for some support. We're now getting lots of scores. There's that huge break point there where suddenly we've got really high scores coming in. That means really good information and intelligence on which purchasers, customers can make their purchasing decisions. So the next slide just shows us some of the gold standard platforms that are there. Some great work that's been done by EBSCO, Bibliu, Cambridge Core, Vital Source, Core Text, Science Direct, and ProQuest eBook Central. So these are, and you'll see some of their accessibility statements a little bit later. And then if we look at the next slide, We've got we've currently just one gold standard publisher. Again, that doesn't mean we haven't got publishers doing brilliant stuff. We know there are great publishers out there. What it does mean is that they've not yet told their story as well as Kogan Page. Kogan Page went from a score in the 20s or something to a score of 98%, I think. Just the final point I wanted to make before handing back to Hugh is that the beauty about Aspire with platform providers and with publishers is that suddenly there's a chain of responsibility and there's a chain of interoperability and a chain of transparency. Because, for example, if you get a Kogan Page publisher, high levels of native accessibility, with a vital source supplier, high levels of interface accessibility and pass-through of accessibility content, you know you're going to get a really good experience. So, over to Hugh.
Excellent, thank you, Alistair.
Pausing playback for some audio description. This graph has a y-axis going from 0 to 100, and across the x-axis there are different categories, and these include discoverability, currency, contact details, response times, DRM content, DRM requests, reading options, image descriptions, navigation, screen reader, text-to-speech, magnification and reflow, colors and contrasts, copying and printing.
So this graph is an indication of where we stand overall on average scores across the different criteria for Aspire. I think the main thing to take away from this graph is that none of the scores are above 50% on average across all the different criteria. The highest one is 50% of discoverability. The lowest, I think, was response times, is down at about 16%. So if we add in a little bit more information, taking out the gold standard Aspire verified publishers and platforms, you'll see it's a massive difference. The red line towards the bottom is all other platforms, non-gold standard. So they've dropped down as soon as you take up the gold standard ones, but you're seeing 100% scores with the gold standard publishers and platforms, which is a remarkable difference. And you can see there's a massive gap between the gold standard and others, especially, for instance, on things like response times. 95% average response time within 5 working days from gold standard publishers and platforms, whereas response times for others are very low, down at 5%. This makes for an incredibly frustrating customer experience if your users and customers are going onto your accessibility statement or onto your website and not being able to find your accessibility statement or any really relevant information on that statement, then it's going to have an impact on their how they perceive your content, you as a publisher or platform, and it's going to result in them making decisions or purchasing decisions to buy content from your competitors. So let's move on to the anatomy of the statement. These are the 5 things that we've boiled it down to. Fortunately, Alistair has written a guidelines for us for Aspire, but Alistair was also involved in the legislation update for the UK and writing these templates for the government website as well. So he's extraordinarily experienced in actually providing a very detailed but kind of layman point of view for how to actually create an effective and efficient accessibility statement. So being discoverable, these are all basic things. Accessibility statements aren't a scary prospect. They may seem like, oh, something, oh, I'll get to that next week. But when you actually break it down, they're fairly straightforward. Being discoverable just means, can people find your accessibility statement on your website? Is there a link? Can they discover that link quite easily? Can they find you through a Google search? Things that you know don't work on your website or with your content. or do work and don't work. So things that you know work, tell the story of what you've done. These are the things that we've done to make your life as a customer easier. These are the things that we know don't work at the moment. Make sure that you have contact details. Again, a very simple thing, but you'll be surprised at how many publishers and platforms on their accessibility statement don't even provide an email or telephone number for someone to contact if they have an accessibility issue and that they need to resolve. And finally, how do we know, which relates to testing. So how do we know what works and what doesn't work? A little section on how did you test the accessibility statement? Which auditors did you use? And what did you test it on? Which browsers, which screen readers, things like that. And a section on what are we doing next? So that is for pipeline. These are the things that we are going to be doing. We know it particularly relates to the area that we know things don't work. So we know this doesn't work, but we're going to fix it in the next 6 months, so that customers know that you're aware of the issues and that you have a roadmap to work to. And I mentioned Alistair has written guidelines, very detailed guidelines for creating an accessibility statement. We're really interested in helping publishers and ebook vendors to make a great statement. We're not keeping all the kind of secret ingredients, secret sauce hidden. All the guidelines are there, the breakdown of the reviews, exactly what you need to do. So just we're trying to be as transparent as possible so that we can help you be as transparent as possible with your statement. So what makes a gold statement? This is the 5 things that we've discovered. And again, the basic things: being detail focused, making sure that you include all the information that is relevant for your users and customers, making sure that it's jargon-free language is included in here. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but making sure it's simple language that can be accessibility statements. Some of the information can be quite technical. Explain it in a way that reaches the maximum audience. Having a practical layout, which is well structured with headings so that people can jump through if they're using a screen reader, and just that's attractive and people can find the information they're looking for quickly and easily. Again, transparent information, just be honest about what you're doing. Aspire rewards, ASPIREreview rewards being transparent. If you haven't done something and you say you recognize that fact and you say that you're going to be doing it in the future, you get points for that. We don't penalize you for not having things. We promote transparency. And the last one, being human, really just kind of ties up those previous 4 in terms of making sure that you reach your actual audience and remember what level they're at and how you're going to be actually reaching a whole range of people. So make sure that the language is simple and that it is detailed but relevant. So this is an example from EBSCO, who recorded a 100% score about a month ago on Aspire. This is just a fantastic example of a layout, a logical layout that creates, in this case, it's providing details for navigating ebooks with screen readers. So they break that down into a table. It's very easy to find the information you need. It's very clear. It's very detailed. They've tested across a wide range of screen readers and browsers. And it's just a great user experience. You go onto the website, you know exactly what you're looking for, and you can find it very easily. Similarly with Elsevier Science Direct, fantastic job here with their accessibility and usability features. Again, as I mentioned earlier, and Alistair mentioned as well, all the links are provided as part of the Aspire website, so you can go and visit all the different URLs that we're hosting here and showing you, just to have it's just a real kind of inspiration to go through and see what other publishers and ebook vendors are doing. And in this case, Science Direct have created a lovely table that really breaks down and simplifies the accessibility statement, so you can really find the information as quickly as possible. 3 examples here, again, of contact details, BibLiU, Cambridge Core and VitalSource, all being very upfront with providing or dedicated email address and telephone number, and endeavouring to respond quickly. In the case of Bibliu and VitalSource, they're offering 24-hour response time. So this is fantastic, and having this information as visible as possible, not hiding it away. We've seen examples where the statement, they hide the email contact details right at the bottom. Fantastic to have this kind of information right at the top, so that people, if they have an issue, they can get in touch with you as soon as possible. Again, a great example from Kogan Page. The simplicity of the language here. All Kogan Page ebooks have a logical reading order, and things like changing the font, you can reflow the text, enable text-to-speech functionality, simple sentences, but containing a lot of information, a lot of useful information. So if we think about the logical reading order, and at the bottom here they said alternative text for all their images, the thing that a lot of publishers and vendors have fallen back on, especially in the US market, is a VPAT. Now, a VPAT is incredibly useful. It is very technical though, and it is very long-winded. I've seen VPATs go up to 30, 40 pages. And that's a lot of information to kind of wade through in order to get the details that you actually want. So we think back to the Kogan Page example, logical reading order and alternative text for images. That in VPAT language means non-text content and meaningful sequence. So it's a little bit more technical. Not everyone in your audience is going to be able to read a VPAT and think, oh, that's got all the information I need. An accessibility statement alongside a VPAT, by all means, please do provide VPATs and direct downloads of them, but an accessibility statement alongside just provides a bit more accessibility, if for want of a better word, to your content. So it's just in a bit more simple and easy terms to understand. So Alistair is going to talk to us about stating the benefits.
Okay, so yes, so just to summarize really in this section what the key benefits are of having a really good accessibility statement. And if we look at the first slide, it is going to be supporting customers in terms of their legal requirement to provide an accessibility statement for content that they are presenting to students. It helps protect your sales, your adoptions, because if you imagine somebody looking at one of those EBSCO or Kogan Page accessibility statements and then comparing it with one that says we endeavour to be compliant to accessibility standards, then you can imagine which one's going to be the most attractive one for a librarian when they know that they have to create an accessibility statement. So it reduces legal risk, not so much for you, but for your customers. The next part is it really does give you an opportunity to really tell your story. And so on this next slide, it's about you telling about, you know, we have done this, we have tested that, we've spent this resource. It is clear. When I look at the EBSCO one, for example, it was absolutely clear that how much time they had spent. So it really helps you tell your story of what you've done. Obviously, if you've not done very much, it doesn't tell such a good story. But the point is, it's still telling that you know that this is important to your users. It tells them what you have done, what you haven't done, what you might yet do. And that transparency is important. And on the next slide, we have that whole sense of the opportunity to talk about your engagement. So there's scoring points available for the extent to which, in the UK basis, for example, people engage with RNIB Bookshare, or in perhaps a US context, engage with Access Text, because it just tells the user that actually our interface or our content may not be the best content in the world yet, but we are, as a result of recognizing that, we're working actively with other sources to ensure that students can get it as soon as they need in a DRM-free format that they can adapt for their assisted technology. So these are important opportunities for you to talk about those commitments. The decision making is the next slide. Good information helps with decision making. It helps with university procurement. It unveils your compatibility with suppliers and platforms. So if I know I've got a really good publisher and I'm having a poor experience with that really good publisher's content, that causes me to then question the vendor through which I'm purchasing it, and I might change vendors. And that could be very good for vendors that have invested in accessibility. So the final part here is the user experience, because on this this last of the core slides, before Hugh looks at the final section, the user experience, if they are empowered through good information in the accessibility statement, they know whether to download the EPUB 3 or download the HTM or download the chapter in PDF format or download the whole book. They know which of those options is going to be best for them, because you've told them that in this kind of context, text-to-speech works well on this. In the EPUB version, you have really good reflow and really good heading structures, or whatever it is. If you don't tell them, they won't know. If you do tell them, you promote independent learning. You improve learning outcomes, because people find that they can actually achieve in ways they didn't think possible. So over to Hugh for the final parts.
Excellent, thanks, Alistair. As you know, the slides will be shared, but there are two links here. W3C have a lot of information about planning your accessibility statement, and as I mentioned before, we have guidelines on the ASPIRE website. We also have a page of resources, articles about the importance of accessibility statements, and these are from a whole range of backgrounds, international aspects as well, not just written by us. They're just links that we have found useful and that we thought we'd gathered together as a resource page for the industry. So final
is there
thoughts.
A chance you could read those web links out, please?
Sure, of course. And it's www.w3.org/WAI/planning/statements. And that's for the W3C. And for ASPIRE, it's www.textboxdigital.com/ASPIRE-resources. So a quick final thought. Again, a reminder of the date that we should all be thinking about, especially in the UK, is the 23rd of September 2020. That's when all accessibility statements are required for public sector bodies. So if you're wanting to sell content into the UK market, as of then, you will need to have an accessibility statement, because librarians will be wanting it. To have that, otherwise they're going to be writing it themselves, and they don't really want to do that for 40 or 50 different platforms. The aim of ASPIRE is really to create a hub to help publishers and platforms, the whole publishing industry, to create accessibility statements. We want you to get 100%. We want to help you do that, and I think working together, we can really succeed and achieve something very special, a completely inclusive type of publishing. Everyone wants to get there, but we do know it is difficult. So we have got the resources, we have got the guidelines on our website, and we really are willing to have a conversation with you, more than willing, and happy to help you achieve the goals that you're setting. So I'm just listing the contacts here. So contacts for the ASPIRE website is textboxdigital.com/aspire-home. The ASPIRE contact is ASPIRE, is the email contact address is aspire@textboxdigital.com. We're also on Twitter @ASPIReList. My direct email address is Hugh, which is HUW, because I've got a funny spelling, @textboxdigital.com. Textbox are on Twitter also @textboxdigital. Alistair is available at inquiries@alistairmcnaught, all one word. That's ALISTAIRMCNAUGHT.co.uk. And Alistair is famously on Twitter at AlistairM. That's it from us. We'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Alistair. Thank you, Hugh. And we've got quite a few questions lined up. We actually start with some questions relating to legislation, and you said at the beginning the importance of legislation as a driver here. So one question is, could you talk a bit about the UK law being based on the EU directive? Do you know the extent to which that directive has led to the same kind of legislation in other EU countries?
That's a very good question. The core of the legislation is going to be very similar across the different countries. I think where the main differences are going to appear, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm telling you on the impressions I have from speaking to lawyers, but where I think the main difference is going to be is almost the way it becomes incorporated into law will influence some of the guidance on, for example, how an ideal accessibility statement might look, or the guidance on whether or not the law is all implemented in one go, or as it was in the UK, it was implemented across 3 different dates, 2018, 2019 and September 2020, in fact even 2021 for apps. So I think the details will differ. The fundamental underlying requirement of being aligned with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, that I think is going to be similar. The other thing that will be different is, I suspect, is going to be how technical or otherwise the required accessibility statement looks. So in the UK experience, when we first started, I was part of a group working with government digital services. When we first started looking at the model accessibility template, it was drawn almost directly from the EU directive, and it was actually very negative. It was a deficit model. These are our compliance failures. That wasn't helpful at all, in my view. It's not that you shouldn't have that. It's that the biggest problem is that even when you have wholly accessible content, people very often have no idea how to benefit from it, which is why in the UK context, the model template that the government provide starts off saying, these are the things you ought to be able to do on our website. So it's much more positively framed at the beginning. And I think that's a really important thing to take across to publishers and suppliers. Yes, it's good for us to know that your text-to-speech doesn't work, or your reflow doesn't work, or your reading order is a bit funny on your PDFs. It's good to know that because it helps us anticipate student support needs or alternative format requests. But fundamentally, do tell us what works and how we can benefit. I've seen nothing apart from, I think, in one recent Aspire client that we served. Nobody else has actually said why an EPUB 3 might be a really, really useful format for me to work with as a student.
Thank you for that. And thinking about different legislation then, how directly relevant are the results and the process, I suppose, of ASPIRE to the US, Canada and other countries?
I don't know, because I'm not familiar with their legislation. I think what would be interesting, if we knew what that legislation was, we'd be happy to have conversations there. And one of the things that we've already done, as Hugh mentioned, in the ASPIRE project, we've taken the legislation in this context, and we've shown how ASPIRE would be able to kind of slot into these different elements. That bit of information allows you to tick off. It tells you what it does, it tells you what it doesn't do, those sorts of things. So I suspect at a macro level, that will be fairly compatible. A lot depends on whether or not the legislation is framed around the spirit of the law or the letter of the law. In the
think
UK
also,
basis, it's sorry, Hugh.
I think also there's a question of separating out slightly from the law. Section 508 in the US doesn't directly deal with accessibility statements in the same way that the UK legislation or the EU legislation does have that within the actual clauses. But I think publishers have to, and platforms have to just look at themselves and think, why would you not want an accessibility statement? It's kind of like trying to think, oh, I'm going to publish this book, but I'm not going to put a cover or a description on the back in terms of like a blurb. And a publisher would never do that. It's the same with if you give someone all the ingredients, but you don't give them the recipe. It's an accessibility statement really ties things together. So it's really it's looking beyond the kind of legal pressures, which I agree absolutely are important, but the accessibility statement and the way that we've designed the criteria and the testing and the review process for ASPIRE is a very general approach that crosses international boundaries. So if you've got a statement you're in Australia or the US or Canada, these things are all relevant to making a better statement and enabling you to tell that story. And thinking about an accessibility statement as another tool in your marketing kind of area or armor. It's a great way to tell a good news story and say that you're listening to your customers, engaging with them.
Thank you for that. And that leads neatly into my next question. We're a bit short on time. We're going to try and squeeze another 3 in. This question is, you talked at the beginning how ASPIRE was initially a crowdsourced initiative with lots of universities, ebook platforms and publishers involved. How could others replicate and build on the ASPIRE model, maybe in their own markets?
That's a nice. It's a nice approach. We did have some colleagues in Australia doing some work with Australian publishers on the basis of the ASPIRE model. Essentially, the original process we took is still on the original ASPIRE website. It doesn't look as nice as Hugh's website, but all that information is there. All the data's there. The process that we did, step by step, is there. Now I will find the URL in a second and I'll pop it in here, because that, I mean, it was very much an open access, Creative Commons kind of piece of work, and we would be delighted if people wanted to replicate the crowdsourced version in their own jurisdictions. The one thing I would say is doing it is an awful lot of hard work, and you need to have good networks that can carry you through. It was a very time-consuming piece of work.
Thank you for that. I had a question from one of our attendees around maybe the way that information was presented on the site, comparing different accessibility features using a table. Do you consider the kind of accessibility of the accessibility statement itself and its ease of use as part of the process?
I popped an answer into the answer pane for that. To be honest, we focus primarily, I mean, obviously, if there's something was clearly odd about the accessibility statement in terms of its accessibility per se, that's something we would point out. But we have to be very careful of mission drift here, because remember, what we're not doing is we are not doing an accessibility audit of the publisher's ebook or the publisher's or the platform provider's interface. We're auditing the information they give. And in the same way, we're not primarily doing an accessibility audit of their web page. And although we sometimes pick things out in the feedback that we give them, that's not what we're scoring them for. We're scoring them for, have they told the typical user with a disability how they can maximize the benefits, minimize the barriers, and perhaps be forewarned of any potential difficulties. Hugh, is there anything you want to add to that?
I'm just thinking about the particular example, which was, I think, the Science Direct one. I remember talking to Ted at Science Direct, and that was specifically designed, the table with accessibility in mind. But as Alistair says, that's not something we're testing as the kind of website. We're actually testing the information, but the tables that have been shown in EBSCO1 as well were designed specifically for accessibility, which is fantastic.
Thank you for that clarification. I need a really short answer on this one, but how does this ASPIRE process relate to the third-party certification of EPUB workflows, like, for example, Benetech's Global Certified Accessible? And I'll ask you to be brief on this, please.
It's not a scoring criteria, I must admit, at the moment. So if you are Benetech scored or global certified accessible, it's not a scoring criteria at the moment for ASPIRE, but it does bake into the fact that what formats you have available, that is a criteria, and it's something that we'd love to see on that accessibility statement. You're not penalised if you don't have it, but it's a good thing to have, but it's not a direct influence on your score at the current time.
So it sounds like two kind of complementary approaches. Did I get that right?
Exactly, yes, yeah.
Great, super.
Yeah, and the other thing I would just add very quickly is that people may not yet be in a position where they could work at that level in terms of their overall workflows and things, but they could still be giving us really good user-focused information that would help users make best use of what they currently produce, whatever its level is.
Thank you for that. Okay, we're coming to the end of this session. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Alistair and Hugh, thank you for sharing your wonderful information and your expertise. So coming up in the next few weeks, we have the following webinar topics. On May the 6th, we have publishing, accessibility, W3 standards, where are we and how do we get here? On May the 13th, we have easy access to books and articles through a smart speaker. And on May the 20th, we have leveraging InDesign for accessible EPUB creation. Make sure you're signed up to the webinar announcements mailing list to learn about new topics as we add them. And if you'd like to suggest a subject, or if you're considering presenting a webinar, then please email us at webinars@daisy.org. I hope you'll join us again next week. In the meantime, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.